And just wanted to confirm that we're starting with.
Yes, Mr. Chair, the important part is that Kaya is here and Commissioner Roper, and they will lead you through the Transfer Council report and their request for your approval for HECC submission to the legislature.
Great. Thank you. So, and this is the last time I get to say this, Commissioner Roper, please take it away.
I think the important and operative phrase there was that it's good that Kaya is here. So Kaya will actually talk about the report. But what I like to do is just spend a few minutes talking about the Transfer Council, since obviously that's a group that operates out of our view, but nonetheless is doing important work, in which the commission is aligned. And so I'd just like to start and talk a little bit about that, and then move it over to Kaya. So the first thing I want to talk about is the leadership of the council, and the co-chairs. I don't know how they came to be named, but whoever identified them nailed it. The council just has remarkable leadership and chairs, and Teresa Revnes and Susan Jeffords. And part of that is the way they started in terms of even just a setup for the group's work. And I think they set it up in a way in terms of their own demeanor and their approach that really allows the group to really be engaged. And for them to be able to bring full voices to the group. And so one of the things they do a really good job of is just creating spaces so that all of the voices there can be included. And really sort of one of the really important concepts that they use to underlie it is asking people to step in, but also asking people to also acknowledge when they need to step back. Realizing that there is a need to have sort of shared and open space as opposed to space that's dominated by particular perspectives or individuals. And part of what's happened is that they've shown this respect and appreciation for the diverse interest and the range of concerns that people bring to the group. There really is sort of an openness to embracing members' input. So it's this collaborative leadership where they routinely ask, so what do members think? And they actually sit back and wait for answers and allow people to respond. And then finally, in terms of just their leadership, there's sort of this grace and a humility to it where they really let people openly discuss the frames and the history that they bring to these discussions, particularly those things that may surface as mistrust that people bring, and uncertainty and skepticism, which there isn't a lot of, not much of. But I think people are free to express that, we wonder whether this process will work. Or I have colleagues who may be concerned or may not feel that way. So they can be fully expressed as a part of that experience. And they really do that without judgment or defensiveness, which I think are really important attributes. Secondly, I just really want to appreciate the HECC staff. The HECC staff, the work that they've done is absolutely foundational to set up the work, but also to ensure the smooth progress of the work and the efforts that are being done, and not just being an important source of historical context on what's been done to date, but also just exercising this stewardship to make sure that the group progresses and that the processes and the approaches and the decisions really comply with state policy and legislative directives, and make sure that the work is clean. And that it doesn't run crossways to what's expected of the group in terms of long term. The HECC staff service liaisons and communication links to constituent groups and communities of practice and communities of scholars outside the Transfer Council to make sure that the right people are connected and the right disciplinary groups are aligned and assembled and that sort of thing. And so as a result, they're really sort of the key to providing this structure to ensure the group's timely completion of the work. some of which you'll see in the initial progress report in terms of the steps and the timelines that they produced for the group. And finally, I just want to offer just a couple of what I think is some really important themes that operate within the group in terms of the members. One is that there is clearly a powerful shared leadership, shared ownership of this process. I mean, this is really something that people really believe in, and they know is really important. So there's this seriousness among members about moving forward. There's real strong feelings about pushing in the same direction. So there's not this contrarian dynamics within the group. And that people really are clearly treating this as a high stakes process. That there's a lot on the line in terms of doing this and getting us right. The second is that people are really good about stakeholder representation. So people are consulting with their colleagues outside. They're really diligent about representing their constituent groups from which they may have been chosen. They bring those members' concerns about the process, as well as their hopes for the direction of the process to the table. Thirdly, there's this rigor within the group. I mean, they are incredibly thorough and detailed. They ask really hard questions, and sometimes, for me, somebody who doesn't like to go into the weeds a lot, they go into the important weeds about sort of what things are really going to mean on the ground in terms of the common course numbering and the disciplinary impacts of convening people. So there are some really extensive discussions that go on, and there are some hard questions. And finally, I just want just the ethic of the group. That there seems to be this really approach where they deal with all the tensions and the dynamics. And there's this sort of this constant theme of sort of how can we while at the same time, and sort of balancing those apparent challenges. And one of the things that with all of it, with the emphasis really about what's best for students, that in the end, how do we reconcile faculty concerns or systemic issues or technology challenges or whatever, but in the end, and Chair Ribness actually said at a meeting yesterday, she said, we do this work for students. And so students are the emphasis. And so there is a respect for faculty rights, the expertise of those who are involved in curriculum issues. But in the end, it's about students. And that's the thing that I really appreciate about the group. And so with that, I will stop and pass it on to Kaya.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Roper. Good afternoon, Chair Cross, Vice Chair Rowe, and Commissioners. My name is Kaya Sorensen. I am the Interim Deputy Director for Private Post-Secondary Education at the HECC. I'm just going to share my screen with you really quickly. Oops. Let's see. There we go. Okay. I just want to echo the comments of Commissioner Roper. The Transfer Council has really benefited from strong leadership, from collaboration, from a high level of engagement from all of the members, and it's been an exciting council to be able to support. So today I'm presenting on Senate Bill 233, the Transfer Council report. And as you know, Senate Bill 233 directs the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, community colleges and universities to improve academic credit transfer and transfer pathways between Oregon's public community colleges and universities. The bill directs the HECC to establish a 15-member transfer council with representation from the universities, colleges, and from secondary education. The council is tasked with developing recommendations on a common course numbering system, major transfer maps, and other credit transfer related concerns. And included in the legislation is a requirement that the Transfer Council submits a report to all of you that details subcommittees established to assist in this common course numbering work. establishes a list of initial courses to apply in the 2023-24 academic year, lists courses or subject areas likely to be included in the 2025-2026 academic year, and lists the courses or subject areas which may include CTE studies that the Council anticipates adding after the 2025-2026 academic year. And when we last presented to you on Senate Bill 233, we presented a list of Transfer Council members. And since that time, the Council has accomplished a significant and impressive amount of work in a very short period of time. So first, just for a brief history, the recruitment of the Transfer Council began in late July of 2021. And the Council has had its first meeting in October 21st of 2021, and to date has met monthly for a total of 5 times. And just as a quick reminder, the Council has 15 members consisting of academic officers, faculty members, public high school teacher who also teaches accelerated college credit, transfer specialists, students, and Commissioner Roper serves as our ex officio member. And while the Council is actually only required to meet every 3 months because of their dedication to the work and the impending timelines or the deadlines, they've met monthly to be able to meet all of those deadlines. And they've been able to be successful in meeting the deadlines in large part because in anticipation of the passage of Senate Bill 233, a cross-sector group that included administrators, faculty, and registrars, as well as HECC staff from community colleges and also public universities, convened over the summer of 2021 with the goal of identifying areas of work that could begin in advance of the passage of the bill to ensure the successful implementation of the bill. And in part because of their foresight, a draft course transfer list was created by registrars. And I just want to acknowledge the work of Rebecca Mathern from Oregon State University and Emily Sherritt from Eastern Oregon University, and in particular Emily, who did the heavy lift of creating this list from this complex map of courses across our institutions. The list contains top transfer courses and the number of times that a course transferred into public universities from an Oregon community college over a period of 3 years, and the list had approximately 80 courses on it. Because of this list, when the Transfer Council met to create the courses that would be implemented by each deadline, they were able to get a running start because they could draw from that list. They also identified further criteria for narrowing it down for each deadline, which you can see on this slide. So the Council voted to attend to sequencing, so looking at how courses are bunched together, look at low-hanging fruit, so courses that already have common learning outcomes or common names or common numbers, to ensure that there's attention to faculty workload, so not asking faculty to both serve on a major transfer map group and common course numbering at the same time, to pay attention to whether or not and prioritize if courses are prereqs for another course, to not overburden any one discipline, so a distribution of courses from across disciplines, and then a commitment to revisit this methodology annually to ensure that we continue to improve our processes and ensure that we're selecting courses that best serve students. And finally, the Council voted in favor of focusing on at least 9 courses, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit, for 2023-24, and then up to at least half of that top 80 transfer course list created by registrars by 2025-2026, and then the remaining courses after 2025-2026. So using that criteria, the list of 80 was narrowed down into a draft list by each legislatively mandated deadline, and at this point, we needed feedback from faculty. So an email was sent to provosts and chief academic officers from community colleges with a faculty feedback form. The form contained background information, that registrar course list, and then the proposed course list based on the criteria established by the Transfer Council. Faculty were asked to comment on the course clustering, if any courses were not included on the list that should be, which courses were largely aligned, and then they had opportunities to provide any open-ended feedback. We got a lot of responses in a short period of time. So we had 70 responses, and we had responses from all of the public universities and all 17 community colleges. So this is an example of an original list and a final list. So the original list had a cluster of writing, math, and communications and public speaking. So this is for the deadline of 2023-2024. And then based on faculty feedback and also transfer council discussion, and the transfer council voted on a final list, which just amended the math proposed courses. So it went from 105, 243, and 244 to 105, 111, 112, 243, and 244. So that's quantitative literacy, college algebra, elementary functions, and stats 1 and 2. And the reason why the number of courses totals to about 11 for the first deadline is in part because 2023-24 is a fast approaching deadline. We consulted with other states as we were beginning this work, and the common feedback that we heard is that the heaviest lift and a key area of work for success for Common Course numbering is first establishing and standing up a numbering system. And so prioritizing that numbering system will allow for easing the work and getting the work to move forward more quickly in the future. So we prioritize low-hanging fruit courses and a smaller number for this first deadline, and also prioritize getting that numbering system stood up. And then for 2025-2026, we add in a significant up to half of that top 80 transfer course list. So you can see here there's math, Spanish, English, health and fitness. Health and fitness was slightly more complicated. The way that it's offered across institutions is not similar. So we need a subcommittee to look at that and make recommendations on the best way to approach health and fitness. Writing, econ, history, chemistry, sociology, psych, biology, and business. And then again, for beyond 2025-2026, there's a commitment to revisit that highly transferred course list to make sure we refresh the data and prioritize the completion of courses on that new list. We'll also prioritize the most commonly taken courses at community colleges, and a subcommittee will be convened to discuss the best way to approach career and technical education courses. The council also approved a large number of subcommittees. So all of the major transfer map work groups are now subcommittees, as well as the Oregon Transfer and Articulation Committee has been approved as a temporary subcommittee of the Transfer Council. A Common Course Numbering System subcommittee has been approved, as well as disciplinary committees to do the work of aligning those courses for Common Course numbering. Next steps, the Transfer Council will need to review and approve the sociology major transfer map. They will need to advise over future major transfer maps. We'll need to create a student appeals process. There will be an annual report. They'll need to establish a system to house Common Course numbering and a system to maintain Common Course numbering. And finally, Senate Bill 233 requires the Commission to report to the legislature by March 15th, 2022 on the activities of the Transfer Council and any recommendations for additional legislation the Commission determines would assist in the development of the Common Course numbering system. HECC staff recommends that the Commission fulfill this requirement by adopting and submitting to the legislature the Transfer Council report presented here. HECC staff and the Transfer Council do not recommend pursuing further legislation at this time, although they may identify legislative needs once the Council enters a more substantive phase of this work. Thank you.
All I can say is, wow, what a tremendous body of work for a short amount of time. I think this exceeds our hopes for this work. So congratulations on that. Questions? Commissioner Gillard.
Oh, I think Enrique was first. Go ahead, Enrique.
Oh, okay.
No worries. Thank you. So well, great job on this long overdue conversation. It's been happening for around 4 or 5 years. I feel that we're missing one piece, and that maybe it's been part of the discussion of the council, because I understand you have credit evaluators and faculty and administrators, but on the perception, as a, if we are speaking to the public, if I take my advising hat off, my advising perspective, I'm hearing the numbering is going to change the problems. And if I'm a member of the public, that sounds nice and pretty, but that's not the real problem. Changing the numbering on the courses is not the problem. The problem is the content or the abstract that is described in the catalogs, because a lot of people will see who have access to a catalog online or on campus, and they'll think that, hey, this Anthropology 101 is the same as Anthropology 1 at OSU. It may not be the same. So I really encourage the council to go back and really have the faculty work with each other and really build from one another. That actually my content that I'm teaching at a community college will easily transfer off to the knowledge base to a higher level, junior, senior level anthropology class at OSU or a different school. So the numbering it's a small problem. I highly recommend to keep an eye on the content of the class, the description of the catalogs. Because if I pick on Anthropology 101, because of the number, because students tend to do it a lot, they're going to go to a different school, and all of us here said, oh, Anthropology 1 is supposed to transfer, and the 4-year schools are going to say, well, the numbering is the same thing. You told us to do the numbering correctly, but the content is not what has changed. So then when it transfers, it's going to transfer as a different anthropology class. So please don't lose focus of the content. The numbering is a small part of the issue. Someone who's not in education, it's easy. Oh, it looks nice. It's easy to transfer to a different school, but it's the content. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that comment. We actually, what I neglected to tell you is that a charge was created and voted on by the Transfer Council that included instructions on how to align these courses. And specifically, each faculty disciplinary subcommittee is charged with creating common learning outcomes from which groups can add to but can't subtract from. So there has to be a significant number of common learning outcomes. They're also looking at aligning the credits associated with each course, as well as creating a common course description. So those disciplinary subcommittees are tasked with doing those things. So I appreciate your comment there.
Can I have a quick follow-up on that then? So I will recommend this body to think about the students that have been enrolled in the last 5 years or 7 years who dropped school because of COVID or because of other reasons, and they try to come back 5 or 4 years later. All their credit load or the description is going to be different. So I think that the faculty have to be, and this body has to be really careful that we say, well, you took that course 5, 6 years ago. We no longer have that course because we changed. So now we're sort of hurting people who were in the pipeline and they had to drop. I hope that the universities, specifically the universities, are able to make accommodations for those or able to challenge those courses, right, with assistance, right, because the students don't know, and get credit for those classes that could have been, right, acceptable. But since we're changing the system, I just hope that we don't miss those students who drop and want to come back to the system later on. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I'm by no means an expert on this, but my understanding is that a common practice across the institutions is to identify a catalog year for when a student begins their educational trajectory, and then the courses that are offered under that catalog year are honored for a period of 8 to 10 years, so that students don't encounter those problems. But I can't remember if it's 8 to 10 years 8 or 10. But there is a period where those courses are honored for students so that they don't encounter problems such as you've identified.
Yeah, that's correct. That students will graduate under the, or accountable for the catalog that they're admitted under.
Thank you.
Yeah. And this is an example of the weeds that they get into, that the detail that folks are dealing with to account for sort of the kind of things that aren't easily shared in a report. But all the kinds of questions that you raised, these are the kinds of questions that are raised around the table for people who are in the kind of roles that that you're in, as well as other roles.
Thank you, Enrique. Frank?
Oh, thank you, Terry. Enrique asked one of my questions, Kaya, so I'll ask the other. But first, to follow up on Enrique's, it's been my experience over the many years that the Common Course content, there's this loosely agreed to number of, if 70% of the course content is replicated, and that's what you're referring to, Kaya, this baseline of content. If 70% is the same, at least 70%, then the individual institution or subdiscipline has that option to add up to 30% of different things the way they like for their area. In Roseburg, it could pertain to the lumber industry. At Clatsop, where Greg used to be a long time ago, could be the fishing and lumber industry as well. It could be a lot of different things, but that gives meaning or relevance, especially in 105, Math 105, the contemporary math course, that gives meaning and relevance for that student, that community in those areas, those particular areas. So thanks for pointing that out, Kaya, that there is that base where we want Common Course content, but above which each institution can develop a more relevant, more meaningful educational experience for their students for that course. The question I had to do with credits. And I see it in math a lot, where some of our institutions, 24 public institutions of higher ed in our state, some of our institutions might have a 5-credit Math 111, college algebra, and some may have a 4-credit. And they are never, I won't say never, but it's unlikely they'll come to a solid kumbaya agreement. Okay, it's all going to be 5 credits. Every institution or every institution is going to be 4 credits. And what we know in the past is, all right, it's 5 credits, but at OSU, it's only 4 credits. OSU will accept that 5-credit transfer as 4 credits of Math 111 plus 1 credit of elective credit with a maximum of so many elective credits towards that bachelor's degree at OSU in my example. Kaya, has that been addressed or spoken about? Is my example maybe one of the solutions to a 5-credit course only transferring as a 4-credit course, therefore 1 credit would be transferable by that accepting institution as an elective credit?
So we did have extensive conversation about this very topic, and in particular around the math conversation. I just want to share with you really quickly the charge here. Let me grab. Here we go. So we, after extensive conversation, we decided that it was in the best interest of students to try to align the credits awarded. And so it says members of the faculty course alignment subcommittees must align the number of credits for which a course is offered. However, we do have a process where feedback can be given to the transfer council, where faculty subcommittees can bring information or disagreements to the transfer council to discuss if they have a significant concern. And so we do have a process. So if that becomes a significant sticking point, that further discussion can take place. But our goal at this point is to try to align the number of credits because we really felt that was in the best interest of students who are transferring.
Okay, thanks. I think the reason a lot of institutions go from 4 credits to 5 credits, whether it was 20 years ago or more recently, was to there's so much to address in a class compared to what there was 25 years ago, whether it's math or maybe some other discipline. And in order to accomplish that, we added in a credit. Now, we also, of course, added a lot of class activities and class learning outcomes. So if it's decided, all right, it's going to be 4 credits statewide instead of the 5, then we're going to have to look at that common course content and say, okay, what was stripped from 111 that we as a local higher ed institution really want for our students? Maybe we'll put it in the subsequent or prerequisite course. And we've done that before too. So that's good to know that there'll be further conversation, because I think, as Larry and others have pointed out, the process is important. And if the process includes the voices, and not just faculty voices, but student voices, the registrar's voices, then that's paramount for us to continue to have that ongoing voice. So thanks, Kaya.
Thank you. And are there any other questions and comments? This is an action item. I believe we need to approve the report. And is there a motion to approve the report of the Transfer Council?
Sure, I would move to approve the report on the Transfer Council.
Commissioner Heyman makes the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Rowe. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Same sign. Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
your work and your report. All right, I think at this time we call on Jim Pinkard and Veronica Dijon to talk with us about the university evaluations. And Ben, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just as Veronica and Jim come forward, just a time check. I think we'll want to try to complete this presentation and discussion and action by about 2 o'clock. That'll leave a few additional minutes beyond what's in the agenda for the rule adoption. That will be your last item in case there are any questions. So I'll turn it over to Veronica and Jim. They've arranged the presentation and go from there.
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, Commissioners, Chair Cross. I am Veronica Dujon, and I'm the Director for Academic Policy and Authorization at the HECC. And I'm joined by my colleague, Jim Pinkard. I think he'll introduce himself at the appropriate time. Before you today, we have the university evaluations. This round, we're doing the technical regional institutions, and there are 4 of them. And just as a context for these evaluations, they are required by the legislature. We do them every 2 years, and the intent of these evaluative reports or evaluations is really to assess each institution's contributions to the state's objectives around higher education, as well as the Commission's own strategic plan and the roadmap initiatives. We do these every 2 years, and these evaluations focus and have focused on areas that were jointly developed as a result of the legislative interest, but also in collaboration with the institutions. There is a substantial focus on student success, and student success is measured in terms of degree completion, access and affordability across socioeconomic lines, and access as well for regional urban groups. The report also captures academic quality and research, financial sustainability, continued collaboration across institutions, and also whether the boards of trustees are performing according to the legal requirements. The way we do the work is essentially, we rely on a number of reports that already are prepared by these institutions, including accreditation reports, self-studies, and federal and state data that we receive at the HECC or the institutions generate. I do want to note that as a result of conversations that you have had with us as we've done these evaluations over the years, and more recently as a result of legislative interest in the financial health of institutions, that the section on financial health has expanded to provide better context, more transparency in terms of understanding what these sections mean. You will note also that there is alignment with what happens with the financial reports that my colleague Jim Pinkert presents on all 7 institutions and what shows up in the university evaluations for the financial health assessment, and that is by intent. So Jim is joining me and we'll talk about the reports that he has submitted for the 7 institutions and more specifically for the 4 that we are reviewing here. I also want to draw your attention to the 2-page summaries that you would have seen as part of your packet. They are maybe more than a 1-page glance, but substantially a summary of what is in the report. Before these reports are actually submitted, and it's done through an iterative process, the whole evaluation process is iterative as we prepare the drafts for your review. There is a back and forth with the institution. They look at what we've done, we get data from them, and we cross-check each other. So it is possible after your feedback today or additional information we might get from the institutions, we will correct for errors of fact, but not substantially in terms of what's in the draft report. But of course, that is your prerogative to ask us to make any changes. And I will stop here and hand over to Jim, who can give you some more detail about how financial health and the financial metrics sections were produced. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Veronica, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. It's an honor to be here with all of you today. And for the record, my name is Jim Pinkert. I'm the Director of Post-Secondary Finance and Capital for the HECC. I want to appreciate Veronica and her team, all the work that goes into these evaluations. It's extensive. And I also appreciate her allowing me just a few minutes here to review the financial conditions sections before turning to some of the other components. But when we assess the financial condition of a university, we use an industry standard metric called the Composite Financial Index, CFI. It's designed to provide an overall assessment of the institution's health, and it measures the institution's ability to carry out current programs and then maintain those programs into the future. As Veronica mentioned, we do have an annual report called the Financial Condition Analysis that provides an assessment for all the public universities, and we discussed that at yesterday's F&A meeting, and it is posted with those materials. There is additionally a PowerPoint slide deck included with commission materials for today's meeting that does provide more information on the approach, the analytical approach that we do take. As Veronica mentioned, the financial health assessment section of each university evaluation is consistent with the information you'll find in that financial condition analysis report. So that's by design, as she referenced. More information on year-over-year changes and the impact of the pandemic is included, and the CFI is presented over time and with contextual information, which is important. The 4 universities evaluated this year all exceed the suggested CFI benchmark of 3.0. With declining enrollments, they are developing competitive advantages, they're managing expenses, and identifying opportunities for efficiency while preserving academic quality and supporting students through graduation. So it's a fairly tough balancing act. Collectively, their financial health improved during fiscal year 2021, which ended last June. And this was largely due to extraordinary federal funding that allowed them to offset pandemic-related revenue losses and pandemic-related additional expenses. But going forward, sustainability is the question. Temporary cost measures will end, and uncertainty will remain with expected weak enrollment growth and cost containment challenges. As a result, the institution's budgets could be squeezed as increases in expenses may outpace increases in revenues, opening up a bit of a deficit. So that balancing act will continue, and there will likely be some difficult governing board decision making needed in the next couple of years as we transition out of the pandemic. And so with that, I'll pause and take any questions that you may have.
I wonder if I might call on Commissioner Rowe. There was a good discussion yesterday in the F&A committee and the reports, and lots of questions. Report and deep discussions. Sandy, do you want to comment on the discussion yesterday? You're still on mute.
We had a more detailed presentation. Of course, all the material is in your folders, and some questions. One question I asked that been addressed, and actually I have kind of a follow-up today, so it might be helpful, was what's the responsibility of the commission other than receiving this, especially if we get to a point where we think the financial health of an institution is in peril. And that's what's our responsibility. Obviously, the governing boards have the primary responsibility. Excuse me, but what is ours? Ben, you want to address that, and then I'll ask my follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, as I indicated yesterday, with respect to the financial situation or conditions of our public universities, the report, now annual report that Jim and his staff produce, should at a minimum signal and publicize any significant concerns that the HECC, the state of Oregon, has relative to the fiscal well-being of our public universities. Right, it was born, this reporting requirement originally was born out of a legislative interest and gubernatorial interest in not being surprised if any of our public institutions were in really difficult financial circumstances. And under a largely decentralized system, governance system, it seemed appropriate to policymakers several years ago to ensure at a minimum that there was transparency and there was sort of forewarning when or if an institution found itself in difficult circumstances. I have some additional thoughts as it relates, especially to the evaluation component. And as you've noticed, we're sort of coupling two different reports. The financial conditions report that Jim provided on all 7 public universities yesterday, portions of which are replicated for the 4 university evaluations that you're reviewing and approving today. Focused on the truths, but more comprehensive than just the finances. And I have maybe some thoughts that are sort of a similar answer or along the lines of starting to answer the same type of question for the evaluations, Sandy, but I'll hold those till later in the discussion.
Okay, if it's okay, I'll go ahead with my follow-up. I'm not sure which part of the discussion it fits on, but it kind of relates to what you said. When I read the individual reports, since we're looking at the truths together or individually in this, it really raised a question for me of together, they are the ones that are having the most difficult enrollment trends. I mean, and that's given national enrollment trends and everything else that in COVID and everything else we know about, their enrollment is still down quite substantially and doesn't show any sign of turning around. Seeing it in the context of this report, we of course also see their huge economic impact and benefit in their regions, and we know their importance in the regions. So it makes me wonder if there is anything as a commission, any deeper look we should take with them on the enrollment, the declines in enrollment specifically. And I'm not assuming we have expertise that they don't about their institution, but it just seems like if we wait another couple of years and several of these are down, 10% more a year, we're going to get very, very quickly into the question of sustainability, I think. And so it's the specific enrollment piece of it, not their shepherding of their resources, which I don't question.
I would just, in response, Commissioner Rowe, and I welcome anyone else to respond as well. But I believe that a next step for HECC staff could be to explore the potential for an exploration or an analysis of that topic with, in particular, the regional universities. Kind of understand their appetite. As you can imagine, this is top of mind for them and for their governing boards already. They certainly don't need us to draw their attention to it. It's
Right.
It's key, and they each would describe strategies, I'm sure, that they're undertaking to address it. But I think we could pose the question, at least, of whether a sort of statewide analysis or some HECC involvement in a coordinated analysis and possible application of kind of policy or investment or effort on this topic in a coordinated way would be appropriate. So that strikes me as a reasonable next step, as some outreach to those institutions to raise the question, right, of whether a coordinated effort may be an appropriate next step.
And if I can follow up, that strikes me as reasonable also. I think it would also potentially have the benefit when we talk about the whole thing built on making sure the legislature isn't surprised. If we can raise it as, again, all the legislators know the importance of these regional universities, and if we can elevate it with them as a problem that might need special addressing financially, I think that could be beneficial to the TRUs and to the state.
Thank you, Commissioner Rowe. This, and we had a little bit of discussion yesterday about how this the declining enrollment connects with demographic changes in the state over the next few years, and the importance of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work we just heard a little bit about earlier. And so this it's as important as it is to approve the reports, to be prepared and informed about where we need to put our attention in next year on the health and well-being of these universities, the regional and technical. This is important part of our conversation going forward. So, Commissioner Ferrara, did you have a hand up? I think you're first.
Yes, just a quick question for Jim. I'm not proposing, but it's more from my own free knowledge from my last meeting. I was wondering, is there conversations at the national with your colleagues to revisit how universities and community colleges are being graded or assessed? Because we know facilities carry a cost, enrollment is in decline, and there's so many costs within the system. I feel that we have a decline on population as well. People are going to higher ed and K through 12, plus seeing a drop of 20,000 students this year. Is there a conversation at your level, Jen, that people are rethinking we should reassess things differently so that we don't impact the universities and community colleges differently?
The short answer is yes, there is. There's at the federal level and amongst different higher education stakeholders and researchers, there's a lot of work going on around how do we effectively assess. The finances are one thing, right? And the federal government has a very similar approach with financial ratios that they use. And in the interests of full disclosure, there was an audit report that came out last year that found their approach only identified college closures about half the time. So it wasn't a very good predictive approach. And ours is likely not either. And so I think that, though, too, is problematic, but also it led to some obvious questions about, even if I assess the finances for an institution that does really well, scores very high on a composite financial index, that frankly doesn't speak at all to the quality of the education that the student receives. It doesn't really address, is the student benefiting from their education? And so a lot of the work recently has focused a little bit more on, you know, the ROI indicators, the return on investment, and is the I forget the exact terminology, and but is the benefit that the student receives, we often measure it as an increase in their earnings, but is that increase lifting them out of poverty? Is it improving the lives of themselves and their family? Is it providing them with the living wage that they can use to support themselves and their family, to ensure that their family and their subsequent generations also have the opportunity to participate of higher education? So there's a lot of work recently that I have yet to do some research on. I've been collecting over the past few weeks a number of different reports and a number of different sources, and I'm starting to ask questions for my own benefit, but I want to dig into that a little bit more, and likely may want to bring that back to all of you as a conversation later, a little bit later in a few months. But this notion that the direction that this is heading is really less of a what is the financial strength of the institution, more so are they helping the student into the future, not just make more money from their job, their career choice, but attain a level of support for themselves to address equality for future generations. And so that's kind of where that's headed. And so I want to do a little bit more work on that, but hopefully that answers your question in a limited way.
Yes, thank you very much, Jim.
My internet went down for just a second, so I missed the last few words here.
Jim said that every school will get great funding, community colleges and universities, and he's happy to work with you, Mr. Chair.
Cool, thank you. Boy, a lot can happen when your internet goes down. Well, thank you. And I see that Commissioner Edwards' hand is up.
Jim, you kind of partially answered the question I was going to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. In terms of metrics for sustainability, can you talk a little bit more about how we think about metrics for sustainability and how we think about data gaps, what we can't measure, what we're not measuring, what's the scope of how we might think through beyond measures that are indirectly measuring financial performance or directly measuring the impact of the institutions?
I think let me ask a question though. When you reference sustainability, are you speaking of the financial sustainability of the institution, their ability to continue serving a level of students to a certain extent, or are you talking about the sustainability of, you know, their ability to offer equal opportunity to their students? What in terms of sustainability, what are you thinking?
That they continue to exist.
Yeah. Okay. And I think generally we use the CFI to measure that, you know, when we have a viability ratio and we have other metrics to kind of look at, you know, are they able to pay their debt, you know, is one very fine specific question that a lot of the credit bureau analysts like to ask, and that's kind of the viability ratio. And, you know, coverage ratios and different things. Are they collecting enough revenue to cover their expenses every year, year by year? in terms of net revenues ratio and net asset ratio. So I think the traditional financial metrics that we use get at that particular issue and speak to the financial viability or sustainability of their operations going forward. But in terms of gaps, and in higher education, I've found that we collect a lot of information, almost to the point where we collect almost too much information. The question is really making sense of the data, taking the data, turning it into information, and then turning that information into knowledge so that policymakers like this commission, like the state legislature, have the information they need to create policies tailored to align with our state's higher education goals. And so I think that's just a way of saying, in terms of gaps, the gap really is on the information side. We have a lot of data, and I think we have not yet focused collectively on, drawing conclusions from the different perspectives of our stakeholders. And so in my previous answer, I was kind of talking about, the nature of this work is kind of moving away from, is the institution financially viable? Because we think we have a decent handle on that question and those types of issues and how to measure that. We're much more focused in the future on the individual ability of the students. Are they being served to the extent that they're not just spending a whole lot of money on an education that won't in the future allow them to sustain their ability to support themselves and their families? And so even the very notion of sustainability, financial sustainability, we're likely to reframe that via the lens of our students as stakeholders, almost to, there are some voices in higher education that bristle when we even use the term ORI, a return on investment, because that's a very common term in the finance business, in the investing world. But that speaks to, for-profit entities, private companies, and universities are not for-profit. So why are you talking about a return on investment? And so we always say, well, we're really interested in the return on investment for the student, right? We're reframing that from their perspective moving forward. And so I have to admit, I don't know that I'm answering your question at all. So I appreciate your patience with me, but I think for the most part, if I were to put a summary together in 15 seconds, we're really focusing on the information that we do have, which we think does a good job of kind of answering that question, although it's not perfect, and we know that. And so we're going to work on that, albeit simultaneously working on the sustainability from the student's perspective, the ROI, the value returned to the student as well. So both will move forward, we think, in tangent.
That makes me really curious to ask, not an answer for now, but to ask it anyway. What new decisions need to get made and what new meaning needs to come out of that data? Like if you're going to back up from that, because that's a totally different lens to frame what institutions are going to be here in 10 years from now and what they're going to be doing and where they need to get their students from.
It seems like the conversation about sustainability is not just one about the finances, but about the balance or relationship between the quality of the product, the price point at which people will pay for that product, and the value received. And declining enrollment has a lot to do with whether or not the institutions are offering potential students a return on their investment at a price point that makes sense. Can they get that call? Can they get the social return on investment, not the financial return on investment, but the social return on the investment for the price that's so it's a affordability question, and whether or not the institutions are responsive to the particular need of their And I don't think it is out of alignment that we should be thinking about it more with a more business orientation in mind, but it has to be tempered with the notion of a social return on investment, not just a financial return on investment. This is a really important discussion, and I think that we had a conversation, well, an important conversation yesterday about the role of PERS liability in that equation, and not making sure that in future conversations we begin to address opportunities to think about policy or financing strategies that help the colleges and universities have that PERS liability at least be more predictable, and monitor the complex relationships between the different parts. It's a little like a balloon where you push on one side of it and it pops up someplace else. So these are a complex set of issues. So I know we're running short on time, and I want to we have to take an action on approving the reports. I do want to say in the context of the reports that we reviewed today, there's I think a significant improvement change from the very early stages that we were in when the HECC was first fulfilling its responsibility to do these evaluations, and we made a shift some time ago from doing all of the universities all at one time and doing every other year. So I just want to say, Veronica, great work. Thank you for the summaries. It makes it easy for us to see, the key points and to be able to look at the full report. So, Commissioner Hammond, was your hand up? Did you?
Well, I'm not sure how to fit this in. I simply want to, at some point, make a motion to approve the report, but I want to do it in the context of asking that we have further conversation about HECC's role in sort of how we think about the sustainability of higher education in Oregon.
Thank you. So is that a motion? Do you want to make a motion to approve reports?
Well, I think I did, but okay, I'll do it again.
Okay.
Make a motion to clarify that we have
a motion by Commissioner Hammond to approve the reports. Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Second by Sandy Rowe. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I'll call for a vote. All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed,
Aye.
same sign. Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may,
Yes.
kind of in the transition to the next item, just note that I think part of what is difficult for the commission and to some extent the staff in the evaluations and the financial condition reports is that it requires a frame shifting, right? Applying a different lens than we usually do. And even these questions of institutional sustainability are not, I would say, historically sort of natural ones for the commission. Oregon's governance system doesn't actually give us primary responsibility for the fiscal sustainability of institutions or the evaluation or the sort of performance of institutions. We're not accustomed typically to thinking about our work and higher education in that way. We think of it primarily through a student lens. And so the sort of questions about what to measure even, it may be very different when we're talking about the HECC's progress towards the HECC's goals, right? What is higher education doing for social and economic mobility in Oregon? That's maybe a different set of data and measurement tools than how sustainable are our existing institutions fiscally or otherwise. And I think we have to just acknowledge, commissioners, that this job requires that sort of frame shifting and perspective shifting, because the law requires it of us. We have to do these evaluations. We have this responsibility to monitor financial conditions, but staying centered on what matters most, right? What are our key values and measures and priorities, which may not be everything that we do. And we've tried to apply those through the evaluations. We try to measure the universities against some of the attributes or activities that we think are primarily in the state's interest or our collective interest, the commission's interest. But we are likewise monitoring them for sustainability and well-being over time. And obviously those things are very often or always, typically aligned, but they're different lenses that we're applying. And I think that can be tricky. And then just final thought on this is that I've encouraged our staff to begin to think about how to update this evaluation process for future years in collaboration with university leaders to make the product of these evaluations more valuable for the commission, for lawmakers, for universities and their boards. It's been, you're right, Chair Cross, to note, and we appreciate the updating and the improvements, but the process and the form is substantially sort of in the main unchanged since their inception, because the law hasn't changed. I mean, we actually, if you read the reports carefully, you see they're framed by the law that requires them and what we were asked to do in them. But we may want to go back to the legislature and say we think there's a more productive approach to the state that the HECC can take its evaluation. So anyway, I just wanted to note that and bring back to you any recommendations that we have along those lines.
Yes, thank you. And Lee, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Chair Cross. I wanted to comment on some of the return on investment that was discussed. There's a lot of literature coming out right now that really shows that students who are in an environment where the cost of college is so high, and it's the students we're trying to reach the most, are the most likely not to come because of the sticker shock of what it will mean for them to go to college. Oftentimes it's far more than their family makes in a year to think about what their tuition and cost of and living expenses would be. I don't want to lose sight of what's happening around the state, meaning to the south of us in California, there's a heavy investment. To the north of us in Washington, there's a heavy investment. I'm so excited about what's happening with Future Ready and some of the investment that's happening here in Oregon. But how do we best utilize those dollars? How do we keep the regionals from competing against the Oregon Promise? How do we really put students into a path that's going to lead to them succeeding, but also lead to the success of the institutions? Some of the shifts of what was once required for students to attend, whether it's ACT or SAT or hurdles or barriers that were once there being removed. These are often students that are the competing students for different institutions. So talking about our universities, our community colleges, our portfolio, and how do we help within the portfolio to make it the strongest it can be? And I think those questions are a little different than some of the, well, who isn't going to make it? Because we just don't see the enrollment being where it is. Who has the most potential to maybe grow a certain type of enrollment? And how do we best strategically align and path students to go to where we have those opportunities? Much like hearing about the cybersecurity and there's a growth need or other growth needs that we see. So I think the conversations are right, and there's so much opportunity for the future. And I hope that we will embrace it, looking at some of those pieces, especially when we get to come back together again and start our readings and really saying, where do we see Oregon 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and what does that look like? And how do we help keep that in front of us as the goalpost?
Thank you. And Greg, your hand has been up. Is that from your last? Okay, not.
I'll lower it.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, any final comments before we move on to our last item? I believe it's our last item. It's the rulemaking discussion. Okay, we'll hand it off to Kyle.
Thank you, Chair Cross. Again, Kyle Thomas, Director of Legislative and Policy Affairs for the HECC. Usually I'm presenting you the most technical and unloved rules that don't have a home anywhere else. So this rule is different. This rule builds on the back of legislation passed in 2021 and attempts to solve the problem that's faced by students with tight budgets. And that's when students go to register for courses for the next term, they don't have complete or adequate information about the cost of books, equipment, and services they may need to purchase in order to complete the requirements of that course. This issue is acute, and it leads students to make difficult last-minute decisions, evident in a 2018 Morning Consult survey where 43% of students reported they skipped meals and 31% of students registered for fewer courses in order to afford the cost of course materials. House Bill 2919 from 2021 requires public institutions to prominently display the estimated costs of all required course materials and directly related course fees for no less than 75% of the courses they have open for registration, and charges the Commission with developing a rule that excludes from notification certain incidental costs. Pursuant to the law, HECC convened a work group on this question. The work group met twice with written communication occurring between and after the consultation sessions. The work group contained representatives of faculty, local bookstores, academic leadership, students, and institutional associations. Staff was assisted in this work by Amy Hoffer, HECC's contracted expert on open educational resources from Lynn Benton Community College. The proposed rule takes an expansive view of what constitutes course materials and course fees, allowing institutions to exclude from disclosure only items in the following categories. Common consumable materials not specific to a program of study, so that's things like notebooks or pens. Any item covered by the payment of a noticed lab or course fee, so a biology lab fee that's billed directly to the student on their student account when they register. Any materials or directly related course fees required of students in a program that they've previously been noticed about, informed about, if that course is not open for enrollment by non-program participants. So if students in a nursing course need scrubs, and that course is only open to students in the nursing program, and those students have been told, you know, if you're going to register in this program, you have to have scrubs, you don't need to tell them time and time again. But if the course is open to students who may not have heard that information because they aren't registered in that program, then of course you would have to tell students. And then the last exclusion is any equipment, materials, or fees utilized by students for basic participation in a course, a laptop or a COVID-19 compliant mask if an institution requires it, things like that. The result of a limited exclusions list is that students must be notified of a broad range of items that go beyond traditional textbooks. And that includes, but it's not limited to, custom course packs, digital materials, program-specific consumables, such as art supplies, field trips, PPE, calculators, or classroom response devices. And in some instances where items are specific to a program but costs can vary, institutions may meet the requirements of the rule by publishing an estimated minimum cost. And so the proposed rule intends to provide a near complete accounting of costs that will be borne by students should they enroll in a specific course section. If adopted, students will be able to factor estimated costs into their decision to enroll in a course, allowing them to make a different registration decision if that's necessary to support their budgets, and if they have the room to make a choice under their remaining program requirements. If many students make decisions based on cost, that may cause instructors to review their course costs and build their courses in ways that are more accessible to more students. You heard and received some testimony today from a national association representing bookstores. I've provided in your docket item some direct response to some of the points they raised in their testimony. If there are questions, I'm happy to review, but staff in consultation with our Department of Justice counsel is satisfied this rule language is allowable under 2919 and that the requirements of the State Administrative Procedure Act have been met. But I do want to acknowledge there is not unanimous support for this rule, which provides for notification requirements unlike any that we have been able to find in any other state. Because of how the bill was drafted and because of the work bookstores do as purchasers and aggregators of course materials and information, these requirements do undoubtedly increase the workload of bookstores. And it's likely HECC staff will recommend an amendment in the 2023 legislative session to provide campuses more flexibility to determine the processes they use to meet these requirements. However, staff believe that the proposed rule provides a benefit to students that far outweighs the burden faced by institutions in aggregating cost information, and the institutions themselves have not taken a position on or have expressed support for this rule. And so staff recommends adoption.
Are there questions? Kyle, I just have one question. It seems like the rule, it's like this is a process really described by the legislation, and the rule clarifies exceptions rather than describing what is already in the legislation. And I may have misinterpreted the testimony earlier today. The testimony seemed to be in opposition to the whole concept, not that the rule is quite constrained by the language of the legislation and simply clarifies what is and is not included. Am I correct there?
Commissioner Cross, I want to be as fair as I can be to Mr. Hirschman, who testified today. I think part of the main thrust of his argument was that heretofore in Oregon law and practice, the definition of course materials has been narrowly construed.
Okay.
And so this rule takes a broader view of what is a course material. Again, HECC in consultation with council has determined that we have all the authority we need to take a wider view, but we do indeed take a wider view.
Yeah, and that seems to be appropriate given the change in the way that the course material is dramatically changed in recent.
You just muted.
Commissioner Hayman's hand is up first.
Thank you so very much. Kyle, I just really appreciate the further explanation. I guess I'm reluctantly supportive of this, but I do want to I guess talk for a second about the impact on bookstores, having been directly involved with or overseeing bookstores for the last 25 years. It seems like everything that we do that is good for the student has a negative impact on the budget of a bookstore. And I think if we were to lose our bookstores in our institutions, that would be to the detriment of the students that we are working to serve. And so while I support this effort, I think we need to think about how do we make sure we don't drive bookstores out of our schools, because I think that will hurt some of the students that we're trying to serve. So one big example, Lynn Benton has been a huge advocate for and adopter of online learning resources, which are free to the students, which has reduced the revenues of that bookstore by about 50%. That's good for the student. It saves approximately $1 million a year for those students, but it also makes it increasingly more difficult to operate a bookstore for the purposes of serving those students. So this may have an added effect in the same manner, and so I just want to be sensitive to that. So I'm not opposed to. I think this is the intent of this policy is good, but I just want to ask that we watch that. So.
Thank you, Commissioner Edwards.
I'm just confused now because I can see the origin of it and I can see the intent of it, but I'm not sure it sort of ended up working out. Like it's caused a problem somewhere, right? Caused a big problem somewhere. And I don't know how to think about whether that problem is one that we shouldn't that we should just sort of not take notice of. And I don't know what the mechanisms are to help with that. Can you help me think through that a bit?
So I think, Commissioner Edwards, one of the concerns that has been noted is that in expanding what it means, in expanding the definition of course materials, we're solidly in the realm of things that bookstores don't typically supply or source information about. And that adds a burden to the bookstores. Now, that burden is partially derivative of the law itself, which requires bookstores to be the aggregator of this information. And so in cases where they may not be the most appropriate aggregator, the law appears to deny flexibility. And so when I say that the commission and the commission staff is likely to recommend that there be some minor tweaks in the law, it's so that they allow institutions to figure out a different and probably better way to get this information from the mind of the instructor who's going to require these materials to the website or the course registration page that the students will see. That will not completely alleviate the burden that institutional bookstores may face as a result of the law. But a lot of that burden the source of that burden is from the law itself, in addition to the rule. It's not explicitly the rule that causes that burden.
So just to hammer this a little bit, and I know we're at time, but is there anything else that we can do to in more of a short-term way, put the burden in the place of the person who's the most likely to be able to solve the problem, to provide the information? Or do we just have to sort of let this crank through and produce the pain and then wait for the response?
That's a great question. First, let me acknowledge that during the work group process, the concerns that the National Association raised were not echoed quite as vociferously by the members of the work group themselves. That's not to say that this wasn't part of the discussion, but the nature of the opposition in the work group process was less than the nature of the opposition that you see and heard today. With regards to alleviating the burden, I think that's probably more of an institutional level conversation than a commission level conversation. The institutions can work with their bookstores and the departments can work with their bookstores in order to develop an implementation process on their campuses that respects the letter of the law, but that makes sure that one sector or one department on a campus is able to, at the end of the day, is able to meet the requirements that we provide for and the legislature provided for.
So it's kind of a top down and you figure it out.
If only because that's the nature of the governance structure we have.
Sure, I'm just trying to make sure I really understand it, because these are the things that people call you about.
Yes. Well, and I think one option we have is to take it under advisement that, particularly, Greg's point, it's important for us to protect the viability of bookstores. And so I think your comment about do we just have to let it grind through is probably the most accurate. And in doing so, coming up with suggestions and advice for the next legislative session to adjust the process, which does seem to be in some ways an attempt to simply solve a problem that's more complex. And it looks very direct, so that it doesn't give you much wiggle room to fix it in rulemaking. Though I think the rule that we have before us helps substantially. But I think we give advice back to the staff to participate in the process for the next legislative round to adjust how the financing works so that we don't lose our the bookstores. Is that, I see heads nodding in support of that.
Yeah, it'd be good to get some real data on this so that we don't end up with the pump your own gas rule or not pump your own gas rule forever.
Exactly. Thank you, Commissioner Edwards. And with that, I will entertain a motion to approve this rule.
Moved.
Yeah, is that Commissioner Lujan?
Yes.
Yes, and do I have a second?
Second.
I'll second.
I heard second before I saw who it was. It was somebody was before Greg. I'll take Greg. It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Any abstentions?
Yeah, me.
One abstention, Commissioner Edwards. The motion carries. Thank you all. I think we are at the conclusion of our agenda. Ben, do you have anything else?
Mr. Chair, I do not.
Okay, well then I will declare that we are adjourned. I'll see you all in April.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good meeting.
Thank you, Enrique. Thank you for everything you've done. We'll miss you.
Thank you,
Everybody.
Bye.
Yeah. Enrique, keep in touch. Thanks, Terry.